on the back of the escalation in the tariff war that we're currently seeing. We're now joined by Shailesh Kumar, Director for Asia at the Eurasia Group, former Commerce Secretaries Rahul Kullar and Rajiv Kher as well. Mr. Kullar, let me start by asking you, sir, the expectation, or rather the hope till about a month ago was that this is going to not escalate into a full-blown trade war between the US and China. But the developments over the last 48 hours seem to indicate otherwise. Yunus was there talking about the fact that the view in the US is that China may not have enough bullets to fire at the US. What is your own assessment of A, are we heading to a full-blown trade war? And B, what would you now expect by way of retaliation from China?
Very quickly, I think all beggar thy neighbor policies work only if the neighbor does not respond. But once the neighbor responds and retaliates, then it's no longer a zero-sum game, and everybody loses. So what you're seeing being played out is well understood by everybody, and I'm not surprised that there is some escalation, because Mr. Trump is pandering to his supporters, and President Xi has his own problem. So I'm not surprised by the escalation. As far as resolving matters, I suspect that things will not go completely haywire. I mean, at least let me say, I hope they will not go haywire. My guess is that China will respond to anything that the U.S. does, and I think saner counsel will prevail, and they'll try to work out something. So I still am optimistic on that.
Okay, so you're still optimistic that there will be a negotiation that will work. But Mr. Kher, would you share Mr. Kullar's optimism? And also, what do you believe could be the options that the Chinese could leverage or exercise? We heard some from Yunus, but there's also the talk that, while there could be action against U.S. companies based in China, we could also perhaps see China move towards currency devaluation, sell treasury, and also ease sanctions against North Korea. This could all be part of the arsenal for China. What would your expectation be?
Well, to begin with, I think Mr. Kullar is absolutely right in saying that this is a lose-all kind of a situation, because if you escalate this trade war, it is only going to be at the detriment of everyone who is involved. Having said that, we need to recognize that China is more, in terms of trade, China is exposed more to the vagaries of U.S. policy establishment because of obvious reasons, that China is exporting more to the U.S. and elsewhere. And therefore, China is bound to be a bigger loser in a purely trade-related scenario. But having said that, we also need to recognize that this appears not just a trade war. Trade is essentially an indicator. And essentially what we are getting into is a much broader shake-up. Trade is essential, it's manifested, but clearly we are looking at war at several fronts, and trade is more pronounced because it's visible and it's countable, and therefore you see more manifestation on the trade side. But clearly the repercussions in China will be shown in many other non-trade areas. So that is something which I cannot at the moment fathom, but surely intellectual property, treatment of the U.S. businesses and so on, because if it is a lose-lose game, then nobody seems to be worried about what is the consequence.
Shailesh, let me ask you now, is the expectation that we are going to see a big shake-up, and this is no longer going to be restricted merely to trade, that this is going to escalate well beyond that, and the Chinese will retaliate if President Trump decides to go ahead with the threat of imposing further tariffs?
Hi, Shereen. Yeah, I don't think that this is going to go beyond the economic lens. You may see more additional threats on tariffs, specifically with China, but keep in mind how Trump has been operating until now. So for example, the initial push was against China. It then expanded out to Canada and Mexico and some of the U.S. allies in Europe. the main focus for him is the domestic audience at the core. His agenda is to appease those of his voters who believe that they've been affected by what they claim to be unfair trade practices. So if you look at the sectors he tends to go against, and with the Canada example recently, it's been steel. The steel has been somewhat sensitive in past administrations too, but with him retaliating against Canada, which isn't even really a threat on the trade front, to be honest. But for him to go against Canada on steel, what he's trying to do is send a signal to what he believes is his voting base in parts of America in the manufacturing, or not even manufacturing, but more of the commodity sector, like the steel industry, like coal and elsewhere, to show to them that he's standing up for their rights. So part of it is politics, domestic politics. Yes, but then there's the other part of it, which is his views in terms of America's being taken advantage of, that these policies past presidents and past administrations have put in place have been unfair to the U.S. population. Why does America have a trade deficit? So then it expands into ideology, which is why is it that America helped facilitate the rise of China by allowing the creation of this trade deficit? So that's why he's going after these countries and signaling these bigger trade tariff numbers, because he sees trade deficits as bad. And if you go after it and you go after specific sectors and countries, you help the U.S. politics and help you win in the next election in 2020. At least that's how he sees it. So that's why I don't see this going beyond economics.
Okay, that's how he sees it, addressing the domestic constituency.
Could get bad.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, let me ask you then, Shailesh, about what this means now for India, because, President Trump has been calling out India for high tariffs. In fact, in your latest piece, you write that Trump is not factually wrong to say that India charges 100% tariffs, but he's wrong in implying that these taxes are targeted only at the U.S. So you believe that U.S. is not interested in a trade war with India, not just yet at least?
Not yet, because, yes, and the first point is he's not factually wrong in saying Indian tariffs in some sectors are high. That's I don't think anyone would dispute that point. But as I mentioned, they're not aimed against America. Now, he may not realize that, but that's a different point. But they're not aimed against America. But compare the U.S.-India trade deficit against the U.S.-China one, and there's a huge, huge difference. So just simply on a numerical basis, going after India doesn't really do much. Second is, we've seen this happen since his presidency. He doesn't view India the way he views the rest of the world. He almost has a bit of a soft spot for India. He sees what India may be going through in terms of its
he certainly has business interests here.
That's part of it too. But you haven't seen him aggressively go after India. Yes, he's made comments. He recently made the comment, but they're almost offhand comments. They're not part of a bigger policy push. Within the U.S. cycle, amongst policymakers and the community of commentators, it hasn't even really picked up. And when he talks about tariffs, people usually talk about China, or now Canada in this case. India doesn't really get much mention. No one's worried about it. Ultimately, he doesn't gain anything really politically by going after India, and nor does the country gain economically by going after India. So what you're seeing on the retaliation in the last week on the Indian side about now going and hitting America, for example, on some tariffs, even that's not really getting much mention on the U.S. side, because it doesn't amount to a whole lot in terms of dollars. So it's not. I don't see this as being a critical factor. It's not going to push the needle.
It's not going to push the needle. Mr. Kuller, would you agree with what you just heard there from Shailesh, that, we've got a $22 billion trade deficit with the U.S. It pales in comparison to what the U.S. has with China. And while we might see this rhetoric from time to time from President Trump, there is no cause for alarm just yet for India.
Let me put it, I agree with Shailesh in some respects and not in some others. The point is that if there are MFN tariffs which are raised, which means there is no targeting of any particular country, tariffs are just hiked as they are, and they are hiked across the board, across a number of sectors or commodities, then whether you like it or not, we get hurt. It may well be that China is the biggest exporter of that particular good to the U.S., but we may be big players. But even in our bit, if that tariff goes up, we get hurt. We get hurt. So even if India is not targeted, the prospect of a trade war does imply that India is under threat, even if it's not done politically or through language. the effect of the tariffs will mean will have economic consequences. The second thing which perhaps I think should mention is that, look, if the American position is that, look, trade is not fair and therefore we are resorting to this, well, there are ways to deal with fair trade, unfair trade. If somebody is selling below cost, you levy an anti-dumping duty. If somebody is imposing a subsidy or providing a subsidy, you use countervailing measures, and so on. So that there are institutional ways of dealing with what we call unfair trade. However, Mr. Trump has decided that what he will do is he will raise tariffs. Now, the important thing about how he's raised tariffs is that what he has done is he has already breached the bound levels which America has committed to in the WTO. That is to say, if America said that I will not have tariffs at more than 5% on aluminium, then when it raises those tariffs to 50%, leave aside the economic consequence of that, it is also directly in breach of an international agreement which it was a party to at the WTO. Okay? So I think that's the way to look at it. There are two separate dimensions, and India cannot say that it will not be affected.
Okay. Mr. Kher, while we may not have cause for alarm just yet, India has notified the WTO that it intends to impose retaliatory measures starting the 21st, and this is on account of the steel and aluminum tariffs that the US had imposed. Given the fact that we're going through with that, do you believe that the complexion of the discourse between the US and India could change post that?
See, this is to be seen in the context of, first, what earlier Shailesh said, that India and US have been allies as far as economic cooperation is concerned. And therefore, we believe that US will not take a measure which brackets India with, let's say, the likes of China, as far as US bilateral trade is concerned. But having said that, I think we need to recognize that there are two aspects to this whole issue. One is, of course, this larger issue of a trade war, and the other is the bilateral issues between the US and India. We only recently had the Commerce Minister visiting Washington, and the conversation is reported to have gone very well. And clearly, if you recall the old American style of diplomacy, it always starts with a certain amount of bullying, and then the two sides come on the table, they discuss, and what is expected from India is to give in on certain issues. And now there are outstanding issues between US and India, and it is very unlikely that in many of those issues India would be in a position to give in, because those issues are very fundamental to the manner in which India's policy has evolved. And therefore, this could also be, in a sense, some kind of a first step towards a bilateral engagement that is about to follow, and building up a right kind of an ecosystem for a conversation. But having said that, we also know that India has retaliated. And India has retaliated, and if you look at the list of products on which the tariffs have been imposed, and some of those items, the tariff has even gone beyond the bound limits. So clearly, India has also chosen to associate itself with the rest of the challengers, the China, EU, Canada, and so on. I think this is where the real issue comes in. Should India be taking that position, or should India be sorting out its problems with the US in a more sophisticated bilateral manner? I think that's the larger question.
What do you feel? What do you feel? Do you believe that we should be part of the challengers camp, or do you believe that we should engage with the US bilaterally and sort our issues out?
I think we need to look at it in a holistic concept. It would have been very difficult for India to stay out of this race which has started with China and EU and the others also joining the race. It would have been very difficult for India. So there is an element of diplomacy and politics in it. But at the same time, we also need to recognize that the loss on account of the duty increases on steel and aluminium is not so significant for Indian trade as India should have chosen to pick up a product like motorcycles, which are above 800 cc, which are not made in India and are imported in India only from the US. So maybe we could have nuanced our reaction. We could have taken the same reaction. We could have nuanced it.
Mr. Khullar, would you agree that there ought to have been more nuancing in terms of India's response? And what do you believe is non-negotiable as we sit across the table?
Bilateral discussion is going to happen right now. I think the political posturing both in America and in other parts of the world is too strident at this point of time for somebody to say that, look, I'll do a backroom deal with you through bilateral negotiations, which is why there may be a time for it, but it's definitely not now. Second, politically, it is impossible for a government in India to just sit by and watch the U.S. impose a beggar thy neighbor strategy and get beggared. Meaning, as I said right at the beginning, such strategies work if and only if the neighbor does not retaliate. But that is stupid because every neighbor will retaliate. And that's exactly what you're seeing in Europe, in India, and in Canada. So I don't think you should ignore what they're doing. Some of it is also a political signal to Mr. Trump that there are limits to which you can go in pushing this agenda because if your war is with China, fight it somewhere else. You don't need to have collateral damage all over the place. And I think that message is part of the subtext of these retaliatory moves. Politically, I think it was impossible for government not to have done something like that. So I'm clear on that. To Rajiv's point, I think two things. I mean, I didn't want to talk about Harley Davidsons, but I do want to talk about other categories which are included there. Apples, pistachios, almonds, raisins. This is the entire West Coast, okay? You're talking about California up to Washington State. These hurt, okay? These genuinely hurt. And there's a very vocal lobby there which is concerned about these consequences. So I think to the extent they have chosen such goods, it is also a political signal from India to the United States that if you can hurt us, we can also target and hurt you where it actually pinches, because those are very strong lobby groups which will make a noise. So Mr. Trump will at some point have to do this trade-off, you know, do I support the guys who are...
Right. So you're saying that it would have been impossible for India not to act, and the fact that they've chosen to go after things like apples, pistachio, almond and raisins is really sending out a message to the Trump administration that India is serious about its retaliatory measures. Shailesh, a quick final word from you. You heard what both the former Commerce Secretaries had to say. How do you expect the U.S. to respond to the retaliatory measures that kick in?
Sure, thanks. A couple quick points. One is on the point about India going against agricultural goods. The only counterpoint to keep in mind is the states that will be most affected in the U.S. are not Republican states. These are, California is a deeply Democratic state. If its economy were to be hurt somehow by this, it will not affect Trump. He could care less if the Democrats in California don't like him, because it's not a state that Republicans typically carry anyway. So where India may have been better advised is to pick products that emanate from states that are very Republican and very deeply Trump supporters, because that's something that will really pinch him in the next election if they start to feel adverse consequences. And this is exactly what you saw the Europeans do when they targeted bourbon, for example, which is made in parts of America that are very Republican. Second point is how will America be affected in general? The thing is the response from India may be seen, at least in American circles, I'm not saying agree or disagree with this, but it may be seen as coming from out of nowhere because, again, much of this conversation in Washington has been vis-a-vis China, what China's doing. So, yes, I agree, and I understand that India would be affected by these on the back end, but for India to retaliate by raising its own tariffs in a regime where Indian tariffs are already seen as being high in many cases may seem as counterproductive or may seem as if it's coming out of nowhere. So what India may benefit from in this example would be, as you pointed out, having more of a bilateral engagement and sorting these things out. I understand the politics may not be conducive for that, but that may have been the better way to go.
Okay, that may have been the better way to go. Well, we will see how the U.S. chooses to respond to India's retaliatory moves. But for now, global markets nervous on the escalation, the war of words and tariffs between the U.S. and China. And as two former Commerce Secretaries and Shailesh point out, this is going to have collateral damage and could possibly impact global growth, which is in a fine fettle today. Rajiv K, Rahul Khurrar and Shailesh Kumar, appreciate you joining us here on the CNBC TV 18 special. Appreciate your time and thanks for joining us this evening. Time for us to head into a break. A lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere.